in the UK, and I hope we can continue to work together to drive the changes we must make to secure our future. Mr. Speaker, we have to secure the future of Planet A because there is no Planet B.
Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for her reply? Mr. Speaker, people can believe that the tactics of Extinction Rebellion are right or wrong, and the Minister obviously believes they're wrong. But the demonstrators are certainly not wrong about the failure of politics to do anything like what is necessary to fight climate change. They are right. The Minister said in her reply that we've made progress as a country, and I thank her. In response to these protests is to admit that we need to raise our game and show we can act. So can I therefore ask the Minister today to commit to the following 4 actions as a down payment on what is necessary? First, will she seek to persuade the Prime Minister to declare a climate emergency, as many local authorities have done, to focus minds across government on the centrality of this issue to every department, not just hers? And, Mr. Speaker, goodness knows this is necessary, because we know from the figures that came out just before Easter that the government is woefully behind in meeting the 4th and 5th carbon budgets covering the next decade. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, she is to be commended for asking the Climate Change Committee to recommend a date when the UK will need to hit zero emissions, which they will do next week. But these recommendations cannot be allowed to be buried in Whitehall. So will she now commit to respond formally to them before the summer recess? Only by Britain showing world leadership again quickly can we hope to persuade other countries to act. Third, will she commit to working on the delivery of a British Green New Deal at scale, which could have the effect of giving work to hundreds of thousands of people across our country, for example, retrofitting buildings, and showing beyond doubt that economic justice and climate justice go together? Fourth and finally, will she take up the idea of Extinction Rebellion and others to involve the public in these discussions about both the threat of climate change and the action necessary, and yes, the trade-offs with a process of citizen deliberation? Because the truth is that for too long, and this covers both parties, people have been shut out of the climate debate and made to feel powerless, and this must change. Mr. Speaker, let me say this finally. Greta Thunberg, who is with us today in the public gallery, said this: "I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is." Mr. Speaker, she is right. If we do not act, people will say in the future, "You knew the facts, but you did not care enough." We will be known as the generations with the knowledge of what was to come, but without the will or imagination to prevent it. We will be condemned, and rightly so. The right response to rebellion on our streets is to produce a revolution in climate leadership, and the time for action is now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you can see from the right honourable gentleman's remark the passion with which he has fought to this portfolio for many years, and which I share. I do want to correct him. I don't disagree with the protests. I disagree with some of the methods, certainly not the message. And as I've said to the honourable gentleman before, I think he and I would have been out there carrying the placards ourselves just a few years previously. I do also want to pick him up on the challenge points that he makes. He's right to acknowledge that we were bold in asking for advice on a net zero economy. We're the first industrialised economy to do so. I will consider that advice carefully and proportionately, crucially work out how we are going to pay for it. He will know from his time in my office, in my seat, that the Committee on Climate Change was unable to recommend a net zero target when we previously asked for that advice because they didn't believe that it could be done cost effectively or indeed that we had the technology to do so. And it's right that we give that work the focus that it requires. He's absolutely right to say that this needs to be a whole-of-government approach. I was really pleased, Mr Speaker, we had the Chancellor standing up and making the first ever green financial statement, bringing forward some extremely ambitious programmes to ensure that there will be no new homes built in this country reliant on fossil fuel heating from 2025. He asked me about declaring a climate emergency. The thing is, Mr Speaker, I don't know what that would entail. I could stand here and say, I believe there is a climate emergency. He could say that. Many of our local councils have done so, including my own council of Wiltshire. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And that is why, Mr Speaker, one of the things we should be proud of is the fact that we have, I think, the most detailed proposals for how we will hit our carbon budgets. And I'll answer his point on carbon budgets in a moment. He needs to look at, which I'm sure he has, what other governments have done. It's the easiest thing in the world for a politician to stand up and say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to set these targets, knowing that I will be dead and buried before those targets have to be met. The responsible thing to do is to set legislation in place, as he did, to bind every successive minister that comes along to meet those budgets or explain why, and to hold every future government's feet to the fire, and it is a fire in many cases, as he says, in terms of how we actually deliver our ambition. And the final point I wanted to make is he raised the point about carbon budgets. He will know that we are not woefully off. We are at 95 and 93% of where we need to be to meet budgets that end in 7 and 12 years' time. Well, and that is without even costing, for example, or calculating the challenges that we have had, the carbon savings we will have from the homes changes we've made. This is an ongoing process and one that we are absolutely, completely committed to deliver. I take his point about citizens' assemblies. The wonderful thing, Mr Speaker, is that everybody can talk about this. This is now a national conversation that is happening. We have to engage with citizens, with businesses, with politicians, with local authorities, with bill payers, with taxpayers, with everybody, because there is not one single thing that will move this dial. We have to change everything. We have to do it rapidly, and we have to do it in a way that no future government can wiggle out of those responsibilities.
Sir John Redwood.
It's most important in this area that everything is based on the best possible science. I'm sure we'd all agree about that. So in the forecasts, what is the government's view on likely changes in water vapour levels and cloud cover and solar levels of radiation? Because these are also important matters.
He's right, and as a newly appointed Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, I just have to get that in there, he will know that we have some of the best climate modelling in the world. And the problem we have, Mr Speaker, is that the planet is an unbelievably complicated ecosystem, and what we are finding is that feedback loops that what we didn't even realise, like what happens to the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, could have a meaningful impact on our sea levels immediately. So we have, I believe, the best scientific evidence base we have ever had. The 1.5 degrees IPCC report was based on the best peer-reviewed science the world has ever seen. We have the message from our scientists. Now we must continue to act.
Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, the Right Honourable Lady or the Right Honourable Gentleman?
Be me, Mr Speaker.
Oh, many congratulations to the Right Honourable Lady. Well, if she doesn't blow it, it may well be nobody else will blow the trumpet. And it's perfectly right. We offer her the warmest congratulations on that new acknowledgement. Indeed. Mr Barry Gardner.
I commend my right honourable friend for his timely question. The right to protest is one of the foundations of our freedom. From the Chartists to the suffragettes, the civil rights movement to anti-apartheid, all of those victories were won by citizens uniting against injustice, making their voice heard. And Extinction Rebellion and the school climate strikers are doing just that. And I too thank the police for the way in which they have policed the demonstrations on the whole with good humour. I was delighted to meet the demonstrators at Marble Arch yesterday, and I thank them for speaking the truth. Many of us listened to Greta Thunberg earlier today. She spoke about truth. The truth that we're in the midst of an ecological and climate emergency. And she also spoke about our refusal, our fear to acknowledge the truth that stopping this catastrophe requires a complete rethink in the way that we run our economy, so that GDP growth is no longer the touchstone. We're on track for catastrophic levels of global warming. Yet in the UK, we pride ourselves on the 40% reductions in emissions we say we've achieved below 1990 levels, whilst achieving a 72% increase in GDP. But the truth is out there. School children are teaching it to us. Those figures do not include aviation or shipping emissions. They do not include our imports or exports, and they've largely come from the Clean Power Directive in the European Union, which forced us to announce an end to coal-fired power stations. That's why thousands of our school children are on climate strike. They know that we are not acting with the speed and the seriousness that the climate emergency demands. So I ask the Minister, will she listen to the voice of Extinction Rebellion and of our own children? I echo the call from my right honourable friend. Will she join my party in declaring a national environmental and climate emergency and commit to bringing forward the government's response to the Committee on Climate Change's recommendations to achieve net zero urgently when they are published shortly? Will she do more to engage with the public in tackling the climate crisis? Because it's clear that our citizens need to be in the driving seat for a sustainable future. And will she work with Treasury colleagues and the Bank of England to address what Mark Carney has identified as climate-related financial risks and make the emissions curve and natural capital the key elements of our future economic viability? Because we know that however disruptive the climate demonstrations may have been in this past few weeks to businesses, they pale into insignificance against the capacity of climate disasters to wipe out human prosperity and human life itself.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I just want to pick up on a couple of factual points. First of all, I do entirely share the honourable gentleman's commitment to the right to protest. It is a wonderful, wonderful freedom that we have, and one that we should use judiciously, and I know he and I both have. I do want to pick up on this point about coal. It is not the case that other countries across the EU are phasing out coal. In fact, when I was at the climate change talks in Bonn, it was shocking to see the barges of dirty Ruhr coal floating down the Rhine because Germany took an ideological decision to phase out nuclear power. For an island that is built on coal and surrounded by fish, that had 40% of its energy generation coming from coal when I was elected in 2010, to get to zero now, and it will be zero completely by 2025, is a huge achievement, and that has not been done by the Climate Director. That has been done by unilateral policy decisions taken by the coalition government and continued by my government. And that is how we will continue to lead the world, by taking tough decisions, hopefully with cross-party support, to make the differences that we need, but then we can accelerate around the world. Because, Mr. Speaker, our leadership on coal has enabled me and my counterpart in Canada to set up the Global Powering Past Coal Alliance, an alliance of 80-plus countries, cities, companies who have all committed to phase out coal thanks to the UK's leadership. I also wanted to reassure him. He makes a brilliant point about natural capital accounting, which will be formal government policy by 2020. And I would like to join him in paying tribute, I think, to the work of the Bank of England and the Governor Mark Carney, who have identified the challenge for investors and companies, and indeed for regulators, if there is not proper accounting for climate risk disclosure. Again, an area where we have continued to innovate and lead the world. So I'm delighted to share many of the points that the honourable gentleman makes, but I do believe fundamentally that a market-based economy that delivers rapidly reducing costs of technology and innovation, the sorts of innovation that has seen the price of offshore wind tumble over the last 2 years, is the way to go. And as I said, I will look with great interest at the advice we get from the Committee on Climate Change and act as soon as proportionate and possible.
Mr. Richard Benyon.
It's not just the protesters on the streets or the children who come to our offices who raising this. This is an issue that's being talked of around kitchen tables and amongst families who we represent. And the worst way to reflect those concerns, whoever they are, would be for opposition parties to say the government aren't doing enough, for us just to say, look at all the things we're doing. And I absolutely concur with her very cross-party consensus on this. And would she agree with me that one of the things to be applauded in this country is that we are not like the United States, where this is a polarised political issue. This is something that we, as a parliament, working together, can actually move the dial. She's made some really good points, as has the opposition. And does she agree with me? This is something where we really can reflect the needs and the wishes of people out there by the consensual nature of our debate.
And I would like to very much thank my right honourable friend for his work, particularly on waterways and rivers as a former minister. Again, this is not simply about air or biosphere, it's about the whole planet, all of the ecosystems working together, and he made an incredible amount of progress in that portfolio. And of course he's right, when people look at us and they see us filling this place with hot air over the 3-year forward look about our relationship with the European Union, and then they see this place, this is the fullest I have ever seen it, Mr Speaker, in my time as a minister, when we have been debating these portfolios. Well, there have been very few people on benches opposite previously as well, but they are right to look at us and say, what are you going to be doing cross-party working together, and also what role can organisations like the Youth Parliament play going forward? Are there organisations and assemblies already, including young people, that can help us take this progress forward?
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we welcome the fact the Extinction Rebellion protests have largely been peaceful and non-violent in nature, and that so many of those were young concerned activists, including Greta Thunberg from Sweden, but also Holly Gillibrand, who I met today, who's led climate action protests in the hometown of Fort William in Scotland. And I'd like to welcome both of them here today. Along with other young activists, they have travelled here to meet with leaders of the opposition parties to discuss how to respond to climate change. Given the Prime Minister is yet to meet with them, will the Prime Minister take time this week to discuss the vital issue with these young activists? After all, Mr Speaker, it's our collective responsibility, and the UK Government must show leadership. Mr Speaker, Scotland continues to outperform the UK and is world leading in its low-carbon transition, with figures showing emissions in Scotland down 49% as opposed to 38% for the UK as a whole since 1990. Will the Minister join me in welcoming these figures in Scotland, and will she commit to increasing faster and deeper efforts from her own government to help the UK figures come into line with Scotland?
Well, Mr Speaker, the good news is that all of the devolved administrations and the Westminster Government have worked incredibly hard on this. It's a joint project. We calculate on a joint account. Of course, the taxpayers' subsidy that has gone into so much of the energy generation systems that have helped Scotland with its transition have come from UK taxpayers and UK tax policy. I can't speak for my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's diary, but I am always delighted, as is my right honourable friend, the Minister for the Environment, to meet groups of people. As I say, we worked really hard today to try and get our diaries to mesh with those groups coming up, and offered various meetings, all of which were apparently not available. But it's a total pleasure. I mean, and I'm sure, like so many members in the House, I only have to go home and have my own children telling me what more we need to do, and saying should they go on protest. And I say, wouldn't it just be easier to tell Mum over a cup of tea what it is you want? But anyway, it's more fun to protest. But genuinely, we have to listen and we have to move, and we will continue to do so.
Rebecca Powell.
Thank you so much, Mr Speaker. It's a testament to my constituents, whether they're young, old, of no religion or any religion of whatever shape or size. They've come to me about the environment. This is an overridingly important issue for everybody, and sustainability should be at the heart of every department in government. And cross-party should be the name of the game on this. But if we can do one really positive thing, Mr Speaker, to reverse climate change, it will be to reduce our emissions to net zero and fast. And I take my hat off to the Minister for going to the Climate Change Committee and asking advice on how we could possibly address this more quickly than our targets, because their advice was that we couldn't do it by 2050. I'm hopeful they'll change their mind. So could she please update us on that? And please could she also say when aviation and shipping might be included, as I feel they need to be.
To answer in reverse order, there has been progress made on aviation and shipping, and that again continues to be an international challenge, because flights and ships leave and take off from different places. But there is work accelerating on that, and indeed some investment going into low-carbon fuels, which could be hugely important. I will happily update the House when we have received the Net Zero report and talk about the various aspects in that. I also just did want to flag that we are investing in the first Net Zero industrial cluster in the UK with 170 million of funding from the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And as the Honourable Lady has reminded me, it is not just the young who are protesting. One of the most effective and wide-scale campaigning organisations in the UK in this area is the Women's Institute, which has over 9,000 climate ambassadors. This is a problem that affects all of us, and it is a solution that will involve all of us going forward.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank Greta Thunberg and the climate strikers and Extinction Rebellion for showing, frankly, more climate leadership on the streets than we often see inside this chamber. The Minister says that she doesn't know what a climate emergency looks like. Can I start by saying that it looks like doing what is scientifically necessary, not just what is deemed to be politically possible at the time? And in that spirit, in the meeting this morning that unfortunately the Prime Minister couldn't clear her diary to make, but all of the other opposition leaders did, we agreed to a number of proposals going forward, including things like ongoing dialogue with the UK climate strikers and stress testing all new manifesto commitments to make sure that they do not exceed the 1.5 degrees warming. Will her government sign up to those as a practical proposal?
I don't want to politicise diaries, Mr. Speaker, because of course invitations were also issued. The Honourable Lady is well aware that were not able to be accepted. So we're not going to go into that sort of political tit for tat, Mr. Speaker, that takes us down a rabbit hole of conflict that this situation does not need. Also on the point, the Honourable Lady I've debated with many times, and I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady frequently for her passion and commitment and leadership of her party. But just once, she could stand up and acknowledge the fact that the country she is proud to represent has led the world. She's shaking her head. She cannot even acknowledge that the UK has led the world in this particular area. And if we cannot acknowledge our leadership and celebrate that, how can we possibly hope to persuade other countries that emit far more carbon than us, of a far greater land area, that they should be making the changes that they also need to make?
Hugh Merriman.
Speaker, whilst I've got no time for those that deny climate change, I've also got little time for those that deny that great progress has been made. If it's the case that we have 40% of our renewables in electricity, which is up from 6% in 2010, isn't it important that we actually listen and work with our scientists and innovators that are going to improve this picture, rather than just listening to those that lie down on the streets?
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. I think the debate here, Mr. Speaker, is about consumption emissions, and I won't take the House through the technicalities, but essentially there is an argument made that we have exported much of our our heavy energy creating activities. It is also the case, if people peruse the Bayes numbers, that our consumption emissions are also down 20% since, I believe, 1997. I'll check those facts before the next statement. But again, the whole world's economic systems are changing, and that is why the leadership that we display will help other countries to whom much of this activity has been transferred also to make the changes, in particular to have a low-carbon electricity system, which is often the greatest cause of emissions in those countries.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister put her finger on it when she said this is going to be about some tough decisions. She also expressed concern about expressing it as being a climate emergency, because what she really wanted to do was move the dial. In Ireland, they have been able to move the dial not by leaving the public out on the streets, but by bringing them into an actual citizens' assembly, a proper citizens' assembly that hears the views of everyone, not just the activists but everyone, that has supported carbon taxes, an end to subsidies to peat extraction, and means that Ireland is now the first country to divest from fossil fuel. Will she meet with me and others who are supportive of the idea of a citizens' assembly to talk about whether that is the cross-party, cross-country way forward that we can actually tackle tackle this climate emergency?
Absolute pleasure, of course. And I will point out to the Honourable Lady that we already have carbon taxes. We introduced carbon taxes, a unilateral tax on emissions, which is what has driven us off coal, which again, the Honourable Lady doesn't seem to realise what an achievement that is. When she and I were elected, 40% of our electricity system was coal-based. So of course I will meet with her, but let's look at what has worked and see how we do more of that.
Luke Graham.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Will my honourable friend join me in welcoming the 2017 PwC report that shows the United Kingdom is the fastest decarbonising nation of the G7 nations? And can she also tell the House how the government is supporting new technologies such as the use of hydrogen in the Keele University experiment to heat domestic homes? And of course, what further steps can be taken to promote geothermal energy in Clackmannanshire?
I welcome my honourable friend's mention of an independent report that shows that we have decarbonised as a proportion of our economic growth faster than any other country, not just in the G7 but in the G20, and that we continue to accelerate our carbon reductions. And he's right to focus on heating. Heating is a major problem for a centralised gas-based heating economy like ours. The innovation that is happening in Keele, in Leeds and other areas to see how we might safely introduce hydrogen into the heating system. Of course, we then have to produce hydrogen in a low carbon emissions form, an opportunity to use excess renewable energy, particularly offshore wind. But this is an incredibly innovative time. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, if we can help the world migrate to hydrogen boilers and generate those and make those in the UK, we can export those as well and create competitive advantage as part of this transition.
Hilary Benn.
Very much. Mr. Speaker, when we look at the climate science, I don't suppose there's a single member of this House who doesn't ask themselves how can we make the changes that are needed. And on the issue that she just raised, in November, as you'll be aware, the Committee on Climate Change said that emissions from homes are off track and said that we would need to replace gas with hydrogen boilers and supplementary electric heating. Given that about 80% of homes depend on gas for heating or cooking, how is this change going to happen?
To emphasise homes, although homes are only 15% of our CO2 emissions, in fact the biggest nut we have to crack is industry and industrial emissions, which are much harder to do arguably. But I think the answer on homes is there will be no one-size-fits-all policy. There will be some decarbonisation of gas, some introduction of pure hydrogen, a move to electrification, a use of community heating, if you like, heat networks. There will be no one-size-fits-all. But what is happening, Mr. Speaker, is we have some amazingly innovative local authorities, Nottingham and Leeds spring to mind, who are actually trying to design these new forms of heating system into their own local economies and into their local home building programmes. And that is how we will innovate and drive the cost down. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, part of the announcement of no new fossil fuel heating in new homes from 2025 will also, I think, kick-start a revolution, particularly in reducing the cost of alternatives like heat pumps.
Steve Brine.
Thank you. The protests of last week, Mr. Speaker, if I'm honest, didn't greatly inconvenience my constituents, but so many of them, like me, share the grave emissions situation that we face. Now, I have to be honest and say I don't think panicking ever helped any situation, but would the excellent Minister agree that if we are going to do our bit on these small, let's face it, these small islands, one thing we've got to face up to is the poor energy efficiency of our existing, not our new, but our existing homes. And it's going to require a new Green Deal, and the gentleman asking the urgent question was that. And she can call it Green Deal, she can call it whatever she likes, but it is going to require some kind of new retrofit Green Deal if we're going to move the dial, as seems to be the expression of the afternoon, and lower those emissions.
Well, I can't disagree with the honourable gentleman that this focus on retrofitting is hugely important. I think he and I were on the Green Deal Bill Committee originally. We put ourselves on it because we believed there was a way to actually incentivise, to give people an incentive. Because, of course, if you retrofit your home, your energy bills go down, you often get a higher sale price or a lower running cost. We have to work on all sectors. There will continue to be an element of government investment. We're working with the mortgage lenders. There is evidence that actually offering a green mortgage pays for itself. You can actually borrow for more cheaply and then get back a better rate of return. And there has to be many, many ways of doing this. But ultimately, also in constituencies like mine, many homes are not suitable for traditional retrofit technologies like cavity wall insulation. And that's why part of the £2.6 billion of innovation we're spending over this Parliament has to go into finding solutions for those sorts of homes.
Sir Vincent Cable.
The Minister's right that there are some sectors like power generation where major progress has been made in carbon reduction. But would she agree that there are others like aviation where virtually nothing is taking place? So would she agree that the government should re-examine major expansion projects like Heathrow specifically to look at the climate change implications?
The honourable gentleman tempts me into another department's area. I have to say, I believe most of the emissions problems around this specific aviation project relate to transport to and from the airport, and clearly there is much more that can be done with transport on that. But equally, we have to look at how we try and solve the aviation problem globally. Again, there is no point trying to do something unilaterally that disadvantages the UK economy when we could be working to solve the problem. One of the things the department's been doing is investing in alternative fuels, in many cases created from the waste products of other processes, and that's the sort of innovation that we need to see, because unless we can drop the emissions from aviation substantially, we will not be on track.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The science is clear that we need to stop pumping more emissions into the climate. So can I thank the Minister for spending time with the Science and Technology Select Committee today and answering very detailed questions on the government's policy. Does she agree with the 4 other experts from that committee that the UK has led the world in investment in innovative technology such as carbon capture and storage? And does she agree with myself and many colleagues that the UK should continue to lead the world in investment in innovative technologies to help find solutions to this situation?
Lady for raising carbon capture and storage. Members in the House will know that there was a competition run several years ago that was a rather crude, if you like, point-to-point competition. In one case, just decarbonising a coal plant that effectively will no longer be generating power. What we're now doing is trying to work out how carbon capture, usage and storage are embedded in an industrial cluster so that you can actually decarbonise heavy industry and create a way of sequestering that carbon alongside clean power generation. This is how I think, Mr. Speaker, we will solve the problems, not looking in economic silos, but trying to solve these problems on a whole-of-economy basis.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The global food system accounts for 30% of emissions, and it said that without any action, food and farming will take up the whole of the Paris carbon emissions budget if we don't do anything about it. So why isn't anyone talking about it? I've been sitting here listening to this. I've been sat here listening to so many of these debates, and I could count on the fingers of one hand the number of parliamentarians that are ever prepared to ask what you're going to do about the global food system.
Tribute to the Honourable Lady, who has been walking the vegan walk now for many years and has been a doughty campaigner. And she's absolutely right. And CO2 emissions from land use and from farming will continue to rise precipitously unless we have changes both in the way that we treat soil, and she will know about the UK's plans for improving carbon sequestration in soil, and also how we farm. Unfortunately, the challenge is also how you feed the world cost effectively, and we need to continue to look at technological solutions for that. But she's right to focus on this. I find this and the industrial emissions bit are the parts that people very rarely talk about, so I thank her for raising this issue.
Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is right to raise the effect that this government has had on emissions, particularly from the power sector. But I'm sure she will remember that during the Labour leadership campaign of 2015, the member for Islington North said that he wanted to reopen the coal mines. Now, he then went on to win the leadership. It was a very popular policy. A couple of months later, he then clarified that he only wanted to reopen one coal mine in South Wales. Could the Minister update the House on to how the Leader of the Opposition's campaign to reopen the coal mines is going?
I want to wasn't at the Durham Miners Gala where those pledges were made, but I do think, with the exception of some of the members on the benches opposite, there is general cross-party support for phasing out coal as a power generation source, which is the dirtiest form of fossil fuel. Unfortunately, the honourable gentleman opposite, who leads his party, also, I believe, is against nuclear power. So that leaves an awfully big hole in the thermal generation part of the energy system going forward. But also, I just want to pay tribute to the honourable gentleman. He will know from his own constituency of Selby that some of these transitions can be difficult, involving job losses, and this is why this is such a challenge for other countries, and why the transition we have to make has to be just and fair and ensure that people's jobs are maintained and new jobs are created.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister asked what would be the point of declaring a climate change emergency. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's because it is an emergency. It's an emergency right now. It's an emergency across the world. Glaciers are melting. Seas are rising across the world. And the honourable member knows this. The Minister knows this. So I just don't understand, and I don't think the people watching will understand. I don't think my constituents in Bristol West understand what's stopping her from declaring a climate change emergency and then treating the problem as an emergency.
So let me try and help the honourable lady and her constituents. I don't see the point of saying anything unless we have actions to solve the problem. We have a massive growing problem with our global emissions. We have a massive problem, which we're now realising, affecting the balance of our economy. We are leading the world in this country in trying to solve this problem, and I accept that we need to go further and faster, but I want to focus on actions rather than standing here and saying, I've said a few things, job done. Let's focus on actions, not words.
Redwood Lee.
Exactly. So having instituted the fastest decarbonisation of any G20 country, will the Minister remind the House what is our total of global emissions, I think at 1%, compared to, say, that of China? We all know what would happen to an Extinction Rebellion demonstration in Tiananmen Square. So if we want to make a real difference about this, what practical steps are we doing internationally to encourage China, the USA and India to take real action?
The honourable gentleman's right to point out we're only 3% of the world's land area and rank 17th in terms of carbon emissions, but if he'll forgive me, it's a little bit of a false choice, because much of our growth and prosperity has been caused by putting the CO2 up there in the first place, and I think it's very unfair to say to countries they can't enjoy a future growth rate unless they're prepared to very much cut their standard of living. So the point is we have to work together. I have to actually pay tribute to what many of the actions in China and in India, where some of the most rapid investments in electric vehicles and renewable energy are happening, and that is the reason that solar panel prices have dropped over 80% in the UK, meaning that we no longer need to subsidise them because of the investment that other countries are making. But he's right to point out we must work together. A CO2 molecule doesn't care where it's emitted from or where it's going. We all are contributing to the problem, and we must contribute to the solution.
Harry Wilson.
Speaker, many of those businesses, citizens and workers who have had their lives disrupted over the last week as a result of protesters, some of whom flew thousands of miles in CO2-emitting aeroplanes to cause roadblocks, which led to more CO2 emissions, and then arrogantly threatened to disrupt the Easter holidays of many hard-working families, will be amazed at some of the attitudes in this House today. Could the Minister tell us why were police actions which have been used against disruptive protests in London on previous occasions not used on this occasion? Was it because of government direction, the Mayor of London, or the police taking a decision themselves?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes a strong point, and I think I do want to pay tribute to the Met Police. I think under their commissioner they did respond. He will have seen the response today. I think there was a little bit of nervousness at the beginning of the process, unfortunately led by the Mayor of London, who didn't recognise that actually millions of people's lives would be disrupted. Well, hang on a sec, people are moaning and whinging. What's the point of stopping people using electric public transport and having to take cars? That seems utterly counterintuitive. So I think where we ended up was a proportionate response, but I do again want to pay tribute to the police, who I think have acted in a very good-humoured way and actually made sure that these protests were confined.
Winkler.
greenhouse gas is absolutely imperative, and natural gas replacing coal has vastly reduced greenhouse gases. Does the Minister agree we should back a responsible UK oil and gas sector and not offshore our climate change responsibility?
I do, and he will know, as so many of his colleagues on this side of the House know, that the incredible contribution of the oil and gas sector to the Scottish economy cannot be overstated, but also that we are able to decarbonise gas very effectively, and frankly we produce it with far higher environmental standards than those other countries from whom we import.
Dennis Skinner.
After all this that she's had to say today, why is the government still in favour of fracking?
So are entirely linked, Mr. Speaker, that we are a highly gas-dependent economy, as we know. We have a choice as to, we want to obviously cut the amount of gas that we use, but it's a good transitional fuel. He always does this, always shouts over me, it's very rude. And what we want to do is explore soberly and scientifically whether there are opportunities to extract gas onshore in a way that helps us with our energy security, something he used to care about when he was mining the black stuff all those years ago, and actually continue to see if we can generate jobs as a result of this. And I continue to say, Mr. Speaker, why is it that we trust the science so much on climate change, but when it comes to the science saying that shale gas extraction is safe, we refuse to listen?
Philip Holloway.
Environment is important to all of us in the Kettering constituency, which is one of the most greenest boroughs in the whole of the country, with 30 very large wind turbines generating almost as much electricity as consumed by all the residential houses. However, I am concerned that whilst of course we must allow people to protest, and this is a very important issue, I do object on behalf of many thousands of my constituents to encouraging school children to go on strike. Whilst it's important for school children to have strong views on topical issues, why can't they protest at the weekend? Because education is very important.
It's a serious point. It's a very serious point. I mean, Ms Thunberg's efforts, which have become a global phenomenon, I think demonstrate the power of a young person actually deciding to make these statements. But what I would say to protesting school children is this. You know, we need the climate engineers, the geophysicists, the scientists of the future. Those are skills that you will learn best by engaging in education. And you're protesting, we're listening, we have to work together, and we need your skills to solve this problem.
Liam Byrne.
Yes, sir.
Was the home of the Industrial Revolution. We sparked the carbon revolution. We'd like to lead the zero carbon revolution. But it's harder to decarbonise our power system since the government phased out feed-in tariffs for solar. It's harder to decarbonise our transport system because of the confusion around electric vehicles identified by the Select Committee before Christmas. It's harder to decarbonise energy in our homes when the Minister can't tell me in parliamentary answers our share of the eco-funding that might fund that retrofitting. Cities in this country would like to lead the green industrial revolution. Why doesn't she help them?
I will certainly look at the last point. It may be that we just don't cut the data by metropolitan area, and I will look at that point, because ECO is an important fund that we're using to focus entirely on fuel poverty and also to create more innovation. I don't think there's confusion. The feed-in tariff scheme, which he will know, given his time in the Treasury, was an extremely expensive scheme. We've spent almost £6 billion so far. It will cost us £30 billion over the future of the scheme. And essentially, we've, as I mentioned to my honourable friend, we've seen the price of the renewables technologies that was supporting tumble. So I think it's right to stop. We don't have to subsidise in order to drive take-up, but the smart export guarantee that I will be introducing soon will pay people for that generation and ensure that there is a demand-side aggregation created in the homes who are investing in this. And on transport, I think we've been very clear. We've got one of the most ambitious programmes of moving to zero-carbon new vehicle sales. Well, it is true. The Honourable Lady should look at what other countries are doing. And also, as he will know from his constituency, 1 in 5 of the electric vehicles sold in Europe is made in the UK. We don't just want to be leaders in how many are driving around on our roads. We want to be leaders in investing in that technology that the world is moving towards.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree that caring about climate change and the environment isn't a monopoly of the left? Far from it, as evidenced by the many actions of this government. But there is a political debate to be had, and does she agree that it is possible to reduce emissions and grow the economy, and that this is particularly important not only for the UK, but for many of the world's developing economies?
Yes. My honourable friend hits the nail on the head that there is too much fear and not enough hope around this. If we look at the UK, where the low-carbon economic sector is growing at 4 times faster than the mainstream economy, we have 400,000 people, bigger than the aerospace sector, employed in green jobs, and we can continue to see these global opportunities from investment. This is a massive opportunity. Not only are we saving the world's ecosystems, we're actually creating jobs for the future, and we know that 65% of those under 24 want what they call a green-collar job. They just don't know how many are out there.
Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One way we can decarbonise homes, of course, is by using geothermal energy, particularly in the former mining areas. The University of Durham has done a lot of research on this, and I wonder if the Minister would like to come to learn about the research they're doing now and consider how we can implement this.
Excellent. It'd be a pleasure. And I have to say, we've had several debates on this issue of geothermal heat from old mine workings in particular. It seems only fitting that the blood, sweat and tears of those thousands of men who dug up the energy source of our first industrial revolution could somehow be reused by using hot water as another source of energy. It would be a pleasure to come and visit.
Clive Lewis.
I welcome the Minister's comments about listening to the science and acting on the science. And if that's the case, then the Committee for Climate Change has asked and questioned whether support for oil and gas may become incompatible with the government's long-term climate change objectives. So in the spirit of not disappearing down a rabbit hole of conflict, perhaps we can agree on both sides of the House whether there is a sustainable way of reducing fossil fuel extraction to move from maximum economic recovery to sustainable economic recovery.
I think it's a very important point, Mr. Speaker, and it is the case that the oil and gas industry, which employs hundreds of thousands of people, has contributed billions to our exchequer and is extremely important to communities north of the border, one of our most productive industries, is part of the transition. And the exciting thing is technologies like offshore wind, the sector deal for which I announced just recently, will be a brilliant transition industry, an industry for many of those employees to transition into. And in fact, our world leadership in working in very difficult offshore conditions in oil and gas exploration is perfect for offshore wind. So there is a natural transition. But of course, these are important industries who also recognise, I believe, the role they have to play in the transition.
Joanna Cherry.
Speaker, a young woman from Boroughmuir High School in my constituency wrote to me ahead of the school climate strikes, and she was calling for politicians to prioritise wind and tidal power over nuclear and fossil fuels. Now, the Scottish Government is trying to do this, but until such time as we become independent, we require the UK Government's assistance. So can she tell me this? When will the UK Government reverse its policy of prioritising new nuclear plants and putting the kibosh on tidal power in Scotland?
I have to... Well, I won't correct the honourable lady on too many things, but we have a mixed, diverse energy supply, one that is decarbonising very rapidly. We haven't put the kibosh on tidal. In fact, we actually invested the same amount as R&D funding in tidal as we did with any other technology. It's just that other renewables have outcompeted it much more rapidly. However, I was very pleased to meet with the Renewable Energy Council recently and cross-party support to see what more we could do to support that. And of course, with nuclear, I believe that nuclear has a part to play. It's part of our zero-carbon future. We have a nuclear sector deal, and it's an incredibly highly productive industry for the United Kingdom.
Richard Graham.
Speaker, I welcome what the Minister had to say on our cleanest and greenest year for electricity yet, and also her approach to the Committee on Climate Change. But does she share some of my concerns about the goals of Extinction Rebellion? For this is an organisation which is pledged to take non-violent direct action, but whose co-founder was arrested on charges of criminal damage against a corporate headquarters. To what extent is the government also looking at how we can mitigate the potentially violent actions of this movement?
I mean, he's right to point out that if we should be able to have a civilised, important and strong debate about our aims. It is challenging, though, to see that there are acts of violence or acts of criminal damage. And also, I am aware, Mr. Speaker, that no political party or indeed campaigning organisation is endorsing one of the key asks of the Extinction Rebellion, which is a net zero emissions target by 2025. It's simply not something that is able to be delivered. But I think it's right to have that challenge. But we have to be able to take what we do in this country best, which is have civilised debate, and apply it to the most important issue of our time.
Thank you, Mr. The Minister mentioned her international influence about reducing carbon emissions. The USA is one of the biggest CO2 polluters in the world. Can she ask the Prime Minister to use all her influence when President Trump comes to the UK to get the US to recommit to its obligations from the Paris Summit and to set up a climate emergency in the USA to tackle global warming?
Well, the honourable gentleman raises an important point, but I would say that despite the rhetoric, the US's decarbonisation record is very good. In fact, they cut their carbon intensity by 3.7% to the year ending in 2017, which is well ahead of the global average and indeed well ahead of the EU's average. And he'll know that it's not just federal actions, it's the actions of states and cities and companies, and the We're Still In coalition, who is hugely accelerating work on decarbonisation. Acts like, for example, the net zero targets of the state of California are delivering real change in the United States, and we should celebrate that.
Ms Saville-Roberts.
I too had the honour of meeting Greta Thunberg at the Parliamentary Leaders' Roundtable discussions this morning, and I'd like to put on record my thanks to all those involved in the youth climate change activists and who have succeeded in putting climate change at the top of the agenda. Mr. Speaker, climate change waits for no government. I travelled to London on the train with Heather Bolton from Gwynedd, and she was on her way to attend the Extinction Rebellion protests here in Westminster. We talked about Fairbourne on the Gwynedd coast, where the whole community has been warned to prepare to move out within 40 years. Climate change is more than a passing inconvenience to the people of Fairbourne. Will she accept my invitation to visit the community and see the economic, the social and the human cost of inaction?
Always delighted to visit installations in Wales. In fact, I went to the constituency of Bridgend with the Honourable Lady opposite, and we saw some amazing innovation work that is being led there, so it would be an absolute pleasure. But she's right to point out that this is not just some sort of challenge for a few. The Kármán layer, the level where the Earth's atmosphere merges into outer space, where all of our gases upon which life depends, is 60 miles deep. So it would I would not even get halfway to her constituency if I was driving straight up before I tipped out of the atmospheric layer. That is why this is such an important opportunity, and we must work together.
Danielle Rowley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you'd believe it, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't in the too distant past that I was a young activist. And what I hated then, and what I know young people hate, is when politicians say, young people, the future is theirs, because the present is theirs, and this planet is theirs too. And one of the 4 demands of the climate strikers is extending the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds. They're so passionate about this topic. Would the Minister agree giving them the vote so they can vote on it?
Oh, I didn't realise the demands had got that broad. Look, I think the Honourable Lady is right to focus on something really important, that it is the job of governments to steward what they have for a period of time and pass it on in a better state to the next generation. Whether that is the Earth's climate, whether it is the economy, that is actually what we exist to do. And whether the argument about voting age sits in that, I don't know. I think we've heard loud and clear what the next generation, and indeed grannies, grandpas, parents, all of us need to do, and we need to work together to accelerate our actions.
Vera Hobhouse.
Speaker, our young people in many countries across the world, and I actually congratulate them because, let's face it, we wouldn't be sitting here today. They have reminded us how urgent the climate crisis is, and that we have to be very ambitious, a lot more ambitious than we have been so far. Is the government committed to make our electricity grid 100% carbon zero before 2050? And if so, when will we know about this new target?
Well, when I launched the offshore wind sector deal, I said that we will be at least at 70% net zero carbon for power generation by 2030, so in only 11 years' time. And so we can extrapolate further on that. But if you talk to energy system modellers, there is a view that there will always need to be some level of thermal energy generation on the grid, because you can't do a cold start based on current renewable and storage technology. And then that raises the question about how we decarbonise, particularly our gas supply, further.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's complacency in government why young people have left their classrooms to educate politicians and to challenge us here in this place. So rather than just warm words, in the light that we are going to miss our 4th and 5th carbon budgets, will the Minister commit to setting every public authority and every local authority stringent carbon budgets?
The Honourable Lady is right to point out the role of local authorities in this. I happen to believe that so much policy is best made by it being pulled through at a local level, because you can join up your generation, your transport systems, your cycling and walking strategies, rather than pushing it out from Westminster. But the young people of today, it's such a patronising phrase, isn't it? Everybody in the UK today should be proud of the fact that we listened, and 10 years ago, with cross-party support, we passed the world's first Climate Change Act. So we listen in this place. We might not act as quickly or in the ways that people want us to, but we have to look at our early movement and the fact that we have led the world in decarbonisation. We are listening and we are acting.
Jonathan Reynolds.
Speaker, to deal with the climate emergency requires that we ensure billions and billions of pounds is invested in low-carbon technologies, which will mainly come from the private sector and has to go into particularly heat and to transport. And that money is there, but for it to be invested at scale requires certainty. And I'd just say to the Minister, since 2010, we've had zero-carbon homes, needlessly scrapped by the Coalition. Now it's coming back. The Eco Solid Wall Insulation Programme was announced. It lasted less than a year. Tidal lagoons have been flirted with and have gone nowhere. The carbon capture fund money was put up and then taken away. Onshore wind was banned entirely. The Green Investment Bank was set up. It's already been sold off. And that is fundamentally, Minister, why green investment in the UK is falling. And where there has been certainty, which is mainly in offshore wind, progress has indeed been rapid. But, Minister, isn't it the reality that it's not just the protesters, it's the financial markets too, who are saying there's been some good progress, but it's just not enough? And maybe it's time to listen to one or both of those groups.
I have to say, I mean, many of the things he talked about were being funded entirely by government subsidy, because government has no money of its own. It's tax, it's other people's money. So somebody has to pay. It's either taxpayers or consumers for whom many of the policy costs have been borne, or it has to be borne by the private sector. Shareholders. But he's absolutely right that actually having certainty, having policies that will stand the test of political time, policies as we've set out now in the Clean Growth Strategy, are the way that we will get that investment certainty. And the good news is the world is moving very rapidly away from high carbon investments and looking for investment opportunities, and we are able to offer them.
Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We salute 16-year-old Greta Thunberg and the school climate strikers and Extinction Rebellion. They have shone a light on the issue of climate change in a way that it would seem only David Attenborough is able to equal. Surely the Minister recognises her government must do more. Perhaps they can follow the lead of the SNP Scottish Government with its world-leading climate change targets. And as my honourable friend across the benches has suggested, follow our example of allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to have a vote on these issues, because they quite clearly are well ahead of some of the dinosaurs in this place.
See too many dinosaurs in the building today, Mr. Speaker. But look, again, I want to pay tribute, actually, because I think the devolved administrations and the Westminster Government have worked incredibly well on this issue. We share one goal. We share one set of climate budgets. We share one set largely of taxpayer receipts that have paid for much of this investment, and we must continue to work together, and we must look for points where we can come together rather than where we can diverge, as I'm afraid the Honourable Lady's party often wants to do.
Julie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Climate change is not a party political issue. It's an issue of global importance. And in that light, the government's complacency today and refusal to take leadership on this at a national level is extremely worrying. I'm feeling really emotional about this today. I listened to Greta earlier and applaud her for pointing out the obvious and for inspiring us and reminding us how very crucial it is that we take action now. And this morning, my granddaughter was born. And I look at her, and I think that these children and these young people, we owe it to them to demonstrate. And as a government, can I politely say, Minister, you owe it to them to demonstrate that you are doing more than talking about this. Can you outline for us the actions that you will take to make sure that they do have the future that they deserve?
Yeah. Congratulations to the Honourable Lady on becoming a granny. That doesn't seem possible. But she's absolutely right. I mean, but I want to say this, that whatever I say or ministers say from this dispatch box, frankly, is reported in Hansard and then is tomorrow's chip paper. What we have to do is act. We have to set out actions, set out our ambition and work together. And I'm disappointed to hear that she thinks I've been complacent at the dispatch box. I have tried incredibly hard to show that we are listening, we are acting, and we are delivering, and we have to accelerate that. But she should be very proud of the fact that we are the first developed country to say, help us understand what net zero looks like. What are those changes going to have to be? That sounds hopeless. That sounds hopeful to me.
Chris Bryan.
The vast majority of my constituents, despite living in an area of multiple deprivation, own their own homes. And those homes are ones that are very difficult to make viable and to conserve energy. The previous system that was brought in the coalition government was a complete and utter disaster. It meant that local businesses closed down. It meant lots of shoddy work was done. There were lots of families who were desperate because they thought that they'd wasted money and were financially out of pocket themselves. So will the government really look very closely at finding a new means of making sure that people like my constituents can do their bit, even though they haven't got a lot of money in their own personal pocket?
And I'm happy to tell the honourable gentleman that the Every Home Counts review that we did, whose recommendations we have accepted, where we have a trust mark for this work, should stop this problem happening in the future. Too much shoddy work has been done, reparations have been made, but essentially people have to have confidence that the work they're having done to their homes is done to a high standard and is effective.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tragically, Ella Kissa-Debre lost her life to asthma, and currently the courts are looking at whether the authorities had any responsibility in that tragic death, which I do believe is a crisis in children's respiratory health. There's a meeting tonight called Pollution Has No Borders, and one thing which the government could do would be to take away those cuts from local government, which was looking at more clean buses. Just increasing the number of bus journeys rather than car journeys would not only help lots of people on low incomes, but it would help the planet. Please, could that be one thing taken away from today's debate, which the Minister will pledge to look into giving that money back to councils so action can be taken on our terribly polluted air?
Well, the Honourable Lady is right to point out that one of the problems that we don't talk about enough is that CO2 pollution is often associated with particulate pollution, and one of the co-benefits of cutting emissions is that you get cleaner air. But I gently say I believe she's wrong to focus on a reduction in budgets in zero-carbon transport. My recollection, and I will check this and write to her, is that those budgets have gone up. I myself have seen some of the hydrogen buses and hybrid buses that are running. And of course, actually, the challenge is also to get more cars off the road, which obviously have a far greater pollutant per mile travelled, and ensure that those children, particularly in the most deprived areas, have clean air to breathe.
Jo Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Extinction Rebellion is a vital movement, and joining the protest on Sunday with my 5-year-old son Andrew, we found an amazing sense of positivity, of peace and of passion for change. Young people are leading the way, and we must listen to them. So does the Minister recognise that for all the action that is being taken on the current trajectory, it is not enough, and that what we need is a transformation in the level of our ambition if we are to secure our future?
recognise ambitions need to be raised, not just here, but around the world. And that is why I hope that we will have the chance to secure the crucial climate change talks next year, because I think we need to demonstrate, as I said, that this is possible, that this is not something to be frightened of, and we need to work together with other countries to try and raise ambition collectively. And it will be wonderful to have cross-party support for the UK being the host of those talks.
Clive Efford. Speaker, I think I could sum up the Minister's response today by saying that the rest of the world is rubbish, we're better, we're doing things ahead of everybody else, can't understand why people came here and demonstrated. By definition, it was a peaceful demonstration, but over 1,000 people managed to defy the authorities to the point where they were arrested. These people are not going to go away. So, Minister, what has changed as a result of their protests over the last few days?
I gently say to the honourable gentleman, I think that's a really wrong reading of what I have said, and I'm happy to send him Hansard. He'll find that quite the opposite has been said. What has changed is that we will... everything has changed in a way, in that we now know how broad this protest is. We now know the depths of people's feelings. We are as frustrated as they are, if you like, about some of the challenges. But we also have to recognise in this place that whatever we do is fair to his constituents, to my constituents, to those that pay for the change, and also means that the world can come with us. And I do want to keep emphasising that point, that we mustn't be complacent. Nobody is complacent, but we have shown that we can deliver, we will deliver, and we know we need to do more, but we will have to do that together.
Anna McMorrin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Extinction Rebellion protest over the last few days has prevented business as usual, but nothing compared to what climate change will do and is doing in certain areas of the world. It's not good enough to talk the talk and not walk the walk. This needs fundamental, transformative shift in our economy and in what we do. The Secretary of State is shutting her eyes and ears on this. So will she make a statement today and tell us what action is actually being taken across government to show this fundamental shift and challenge business as usual?
Thank the Honourable Lady for my inadvertent promotion, but I think she just has to look at the numbers. We've had the cleanest year for electricity generation we have ever had. This weekend we went the longest period for this country built on coal without using any coal. We're legislating to make sure that homes will have no more fossil fuel heatings. 42,000 homes in my constituency are off the gas grid. From 2025 you won't be able to build one in my constituency unless it has some form of pitching. I just think the Honourable Lady shakes her head. She knows better than many in this place, given her long level of involvement, that it's all very well politicians standing up and mouthing empty platitudes. What you have to deliver is have actions, not words, and that is what we are delivering.
Catherine McKinnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As she knows, last week the Governor of the Bank of England warned that climate change poses a financial risk to investments such as people's pension savings. And in March, the $1 trillion Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund declared it will no longer invest in oil and gas exploration in order to minimise that exposure to those climate-related financial risks. So what steps will the Minister take to ensure that within the green finance strategy there are the incentives to ensure that people can both invest and organisations can provide investments that are sustainable?
To raise the issue of pension fund investing. In fact, when we had our Great Green Britain Week last year, one of the amazing things was one of the most effective things an individual can do is move their pension fund, if they're able to, or lobby their trustees, like the House Common Pension Fund's trustees, to move away from fossil fuel or unsustainable investment. The opportunities are there. I'm really proud of the work the Bank of England has done on the climate risk disclosure, and clearly we need to do more. But again, if the Honourable Lady has ideas, I'm extremely keen to discuss this, because we will be much better off if we all put our heads together.
Annalisa Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My city of Oxford is the first in the country to create a citizens' assembly focused on the climate crisis. The Minister said that she wanted a broad-based debate, but we all know what happens far too often. We have a knee-jerk, politically expedient reaction against anything that goes against the status quo. So please, will she come to Oxford, see what we're doing, and look genuinely at these cases where we can have a much more broad-based discussion about the climate crisis so we can do something about it?
Of course, and part of the reason that I am so passionate about this is I studied at that university many years ago. I studied climate change and geography and meteorology, and they have the university and many of the people associated with it have been world leaders in understanding the science. And Oxford City Council has done some amazing things in this space. So again, we are really keen to learn. I don't accept there's any knee-jerk political action. There is a clean growth strategy that sets out what we will do over the next 25 years to meet our budgets. But if we've got good ideas, let's stop hoarding them and let's share them.
Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the sectors that has not done well in terms of reducing carbon emissions is, of course, road transport. And one of the policy levers that used to be available was the fuel duty escalator, which, of course, the coalition government ceased to proceed with, and the current government does not want to return to. Would the Minister agree with me that it needs to be looked at again? Would she accept, in terms of carbon emissions, it's been a mistake?
Again, I mentioned at the beginning that you have to do things that are proportionate and fair. The honourable gentleman, I know, supported the cap on electricity prices, the fuel prices that we've put in, because we have to make sure that it is not the least well-off who are paying for this transition. But I would pay tribute to his work and his own personal cycling activities. The City of Cambridge, as he knows, is an exemplar for cycling and for effectively ensuring that road transport becomes very much a thing of the past.
Jim Shannon.
Can I first of all thank the Minister for her supporting the message and also for her actions as well. I was one of those other MPs who attended and listened to Greta Thunberg today, the 16-year-old, a very inspirational young girl, and certainly inspired me, inspired many others in this House as well. She's 16 years of age, Mr. Speaker. She's 6 years older than my oldest grandchild, Katie, 10 years older than my grandchild, Mia, and almost 16 years older than my grandchild, Austin. So what message would the Minister give my 3 grandchildren and all the other children that the climate action taken today will have made the difference?
That by working together we can solve the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced, and it will be difficult, but it is doable, and in doing that we will create jobs and prosperity for the next generation.
Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will know that over half of the UK's planned carbon reductions are tied up in some way or another to EU regulations, and EU agencies are key to enforcement. Assuming it is ever established, can the Minister tell us whether the Government's new Office for Environmental Protection will have a climate change and climate change enforcement remit, and if not, why not?
I think the honourable gentleman will be able to discuss that further during the passage of the bill. He makes a powerful point, but I would also reassure him, as we've said many times, that nothing as part of our EU exit will in any way compromise our climate ambition. Indeed, our ambition and our progress to date is well ahead of the rest of the EU.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I also extend my thanks and admiration to Greta Thunberg, whose speech I had the honour of hearing today. And yes, her microphone was working, which at some point was of concern to her. And clearly much does need to change, and as a country we need to move forward together in order to deliver that change sustainably. So further to the question by my honourable friend, the member for Walthamstow, what substantial and specific plans does the Minister have for how we should formally engage with the public on how we respond in policy and legislative terms as a nation to our climate crisis? And why won't she consider a citizens' assembly?
In or out, I'm interested to see how this would work. I'm interested in how the Youth Parliament could provide a steer for younger people coming to this place. I'm also interested that she says, we haven't had a conversation. I was very struck when I launched the first ever Green Great Britain Week last October, that it was the first time we'd had a national moment where we actually came together right across the UK and talked about what we'd achieved and challenged ourselves to go further. There have been very many campaigns, the Show the Love campaign run by the Climate Coalition is brilliant. But I do think one of the exciting things, I was asked what is different, is that this conversation has stopped being niche and started being mainstream. And again, if the Honourable Lady thinks that citizens' assemblies are the way to go and we should be listening to them and getting a stronger steer, then let's have that conversation and see how it could work.
Melanie, on.
Will she overturn the ban on onshore wind?
Onshore wind, as the Honourable Lady well knows, I was elected on a manifesto that said that large-scale wind development, of which I believe there is now 13 gigawatts in the UK, rising to 14 over the next year, is not appropriate for very many parts of England. She will know from her constituency, though, the benefits that offshore wind can deliver, where we can put up 198 turbines, each as tall as the Gherkin, with incredible opportunities for the offshore servicing fleet that we saw in her constituency to actually regenerate the whole of the coastal communities actually serving those developments. So we will continue to invest in onshore wind, but I do agree that I think large-scale onshore wind development is very inappropriate in many parts of England.
Aaron Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have today written to the Minister, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the House, alongside a growing list of now 71 of my colleagues from this side of the House, calling on the Government to table at least a day's worth of debate in Government time to discuss the Government's response to the Climate Change Committee on how we meet our net zero carbon emissions sooner rather than later. Will the Minister commit to support that request today and to join us in that debate?
Yeah, the usual channels work out that timetable, but the honourable gentleman will know I will talk about these issues all day, and in fact I'm due to make another statement in a short period of time, Mr. Speaker, so we can do all this again.
And more. And more. Plenty of scope. Alison Thewlitt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is keen to trumpet that the UK went 90 hours and 45 minutes without coal, but the reality is that her government is not making nearly enough of her potential in both on and offshore wind, solar, wave and hydro, particularly in pump storage hydro. And Scotland's efforts are being stymied by her government's policies. What specific measures will she bring in to incentivise renewables across the UK?
Well, we are already incentivising renewables. What we've always said, and I believe it's right, is that we have to be technologically neutral in these things. All of these technologies started out in pretty much the same place. Some have progressed faster than others. And also we have to have cost effectiveness. What we cannot do is spend other people's money supporting technology which will remain expensive over the long term. And the Honourable Lady's waving at me. Isn't it incredible that the price of offshore wind has dropped like a technology company over the last 2 years, not effectively a mechanical engineering industry, because of the policy structure and the auction structure and the market investment that we've brought forward? We should be celebrating that and celebrating the fact that the North Sea is the best place in the world for offshore wind.
Speaker, Global Witness published a report this morning which found $4.9 trillion invested in oil and gas fields, either in development or not yet in production, which will therefore contribute to exceeding global warming scenarios of 1.5 degrees, as per the terms of the Paris Accord. Now, much of that investment comes from FTSE 100 registered companies. So what legal advice will the government be giving to those London HQ'd businesses that are investing in breach of our international obligations?
The Honourable Lady, I'm sure, has also read a book called The Burning Question, published in 2013, that raised this challenge in terms of the valuation of reserves of oil and gas majors, and I indeed answered a question from her colleague earlier. There is a challenge around how quickly the oil and gas companies are being part of the transition, but as we were discussing earlier, so many people in the UK and indeed the Exchequer rely on this industry, and that's allowed us to cross-subsidise very much of the renewables success that we have delivered. But what she also knows is these companies are global organisations, and we do need to work globally to ensure that we solve that problem.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister's talked about actions, not words. She's also talked about the clean growth strategy. I wondered what she thought then of the plans to downgrade the electrification of rail lines and to invest and promote, as the Secretary of State for Transport has done, bimodal trains, which obviously part of the time are diesel.
I had a flashback to my old job as Rail Minister with the Honourable Lady, and of course she will know, because her constituency is the beneficiary of some of the big investments that we're making, like the wind turbine factories that are located up there. I think the point on that is that we need to always balance cost, carbon and competitive advantage, and it was the case that we could deliver the benefits to passengers from those bimodal trains, who obviously have a much lower CO2 emission than if they were running in full diesel, and I'm sure her constituents welcome that investment.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Minister, the point of declaring a carbon emergency is to take action immediately, not 2025, 2030. So why aren't we changing the planning rules to mean that all homes have to be carbon neutral now? Why aren't we ensuring that all new buses on our streets are non-carbon emitting? These things are possible. 1,000 people have been arrested on the streets. My view is that they have done so to raise this issue in this House and in the country. Will she agree with me that it is not in the public interest to prosecute those people? They should be getting awards, not prosecutions.
I thought there was a bit of mace waving coming on with that passionate speech. I will leave that question to the questions that happened earlier with my honourable friends from the Department of Justice.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question. Sir Michael Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to ask the Secretary of State for Transport whether he'll make a statement on his decision to delay yet again the award of the South Eastern Rail franchise.
Minister Andrew Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In June 2017, the Department for Transport announced that the shortlisted bidders for the South Eastern franchise competition were South Eastern Holdings Limited, London and South East Passenger Rail Services Limited, a wholly owned subsidiary of Govia and the current incumbent, and Stagecoach South Eastern Trains Limited, a wholly owned subsidiary of Stagecoach Group plc. Subsequently, in December 18, the Department exercised an extension with the existing South Eastern operator, London South Eastern, until the 23rd of June this year. This was to allow further time for the competition to identify the next operator for the franchise. The Department is now in the progress of negotiating a further direct award, which, subject to a successful negotiation, would run until the 10th of November this year, with an option to extend the agreement until April next. We're taking these steps to ensure continuity of services for passengers. This additional time is necessary to deliver the best possible outcome for passengers and taxpayers alike. As soon as this work is concluded, we will update the House in the usual way.
Michael Fallon.
Well, I'm grateful to the Rail Minister, but he hasn't quite explained why such a mess has been made of this particular franchise. Can he confirm exactly when my constituents, who already pay the second highest fares in the home counties, when they will get the long-promised new carriages? Can he explain why, if the franchising system is now under review, he has been able to award an 8-year franchise for the East Midlands? And finally, could he explain why the compensation in respect of last year's timetable chaos is not going to the two stations most affected in my constituency, Shoreham and Ainsford, when the two operators, in fact, enjoy common ownership? Is it not time to restore confidence in the whole franchising system?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for those questions. And I know he's been a strong and tenacious champion for rail passengers in his constituency. He has raised issues with me and spoken in Westminster Hall debates. I share his impatience to get the benefits to his and indeed to all constituents that are emerging from our franchises. This is a huge and complex piece of public procurement. It's right to take the time to make sure we get it right and to finalise this competition. The area is one of the most complex on our network. It has a mix of high-speed and commuter services. It has highly intensive use of infrastructure. I can't tell the honourable gentleman the date when we will be able to make the announcement. This is a live competition involving market-sensitive information, so there is an established method of communication to the House and to the markets. So that means I cannot answer and say little on that point today. I can confirm to him why the EMT, the East Midlands franchise, was awarded with the rail review taking place, and that was simply because the East Midlands and this franchise award were both considered we could get the benefits into passengers before the work of the rail review would come into play. In terms of compensation for those two stations, obviously I will look at those very carefully. The point about the compensation following the May 18 timetable changes, there were some significant problems, but they weren't everywhere. The issue was to get the compensation to those who had been most affected by it. They received compensation which was, I think, appropriate, but I will check out those two stations and obviously write to my right honourable friend as quickly as possible.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you. So here we are again, Mr. Speaker, a Transport Minister forced to dispatch box to defend the actions, or in this case the lack of action, by the ever-failing Secretary of State. Following 4 delays on South Eastern's franchise, we now know that the government is planning a direct award. After 12 other direct awards, including on South Eastern Rail, is this approach to save embarrassment of failure further down the road? 2 monopolies, Govia and Albelio, are left in the competition to run Britain's most beleaguered franchise. Following a litany of failures under Govia, highlighted in Chris Gibbs' report 2 years ago, and a lacklustre response by the Secretary of State, who quite frankly should have brought the franchise under direct operation, it is the travelling public which is being failed. So what discussions has the Minister had with the trade unions as the hard-working staff face further uncertainty, not least over their jobs and pensions? Will he also confirm that there is no intention to cut pensions to staff through this franchise process? Is the government going to stall on all franchises until the conclusion of the Williams Review, which is undertaking a comprehensive look at why our rail system is floundering? And if so, when will this report be published? In the light of revelations this weekend that sensitive confidential information was leaked from Stagecoach into the hands of Abellio during the East Midlands process, what changes has the Minister made in his department to ensure commercially confidential information isn't shared with competitors in this broken process? How is the government measuring past failure of these rail monopolies, and in the light of evidence will he then rule out their bidding as he has with other companies involved in other franchises? With 176 million journeys each year, how can passengers have any confidence that they won't be paying the price for failure, something they have had to endure under this current award? Paying some of the highest fares in exchange for one of the worst services, it is clear that this franchising fiasco must end. And if the Secretary of State won't take back control of our rail, Labour will.
Minister Andrew Jones.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for those questions. This is a short direct award that we are negotiating to allow this competition to reach its end. This is not the end of franchising. Franchising has been a significant ingredient in improving and turning around the rail performance in this country. It has led us to having more services, more passengers at a greater level of safety than at any point in our country's history. Franchising has been part of that success. This is not an issue of failure, it is an issue of making sure we get this correct. Have I discussed the franchise bid with the trades unions? No, because the bids are assessed by officers of the Department for Transport, and the officers of the Department for Transport anonymise those bids, they assess them. This is important market-sensitive information. Market-sensitive information runs through a standard procedure which the Honourable Lady should be aware of. It operates in councils, it operates in this government, it operates in devolved assemblies too. I have, however, of course, met with trade unions and was able to confirm with them that my aspirations for the rail industry include the careers of those who serve it. It was a point raised by the Honourable Lady, who is Chair of the Transport Select Committee, where we had an urgent question about this just before Easter. I do not want to see any pension cut. I want to see those who work on our rail services retire with secure and stable pensions. But these are, of course, pensions from a private business, not necessarily something that comes from government. In terms of the Williams Review, well, the Williams Review, that work is underway. I'm sure the Honourable Lady will have seen some of the evidence papers and heard the emerging thinking that Mr Williams has given at some speeches that he has made over the course of the past few weeks. We look forward to seeing the output of that review. The whole point here is that franchising has been an ingredient in our rail turnaround, which has been so fantastic for this country. The question now is how we take that to the next stage, and that's what the Williams Review is all about.
Damian Green. Speaker, my constituents are as anxious as anyone about the reasons that lie behind this continuing delay. But they are even more anxious that the improvements that we've all been promised under the new franchise actually happen. So can my honourable friend give me and my constituency assurance that the improvements, particularly the extra capacity on the high-speed line, will be available when the franchise is eventually awarded?
Well, my right honourable friend asked a question about how the bid may finally be judged. I cannot comment upon that work in progress, but I can say that we have had an invitation to tender, which was published in November 17. It was the result of a significant amount of consultation. I think there were 10,000 or so responses to that consultation. I am as anxious as my right honourable friend to get the benefits of that invitation to tender out to the constituents he serves so well as fast as possible. But I can't give an answer today on who will win that franchise. That is work that is carried out separately, away from ministers, by officials, anonymised, because it is such important market-sensitive information. But his point will have been heard by all of those in the industry.
Lillian Greenwood.
The South Eastern franchise was originally due to end in 2014. The West Coast franchise failure delayed it to August 2018, and now the direct award to Govia could be further extended to 2020. If the government still believes in competition for rail services, it's hard to understand why his department seems absolutely unable to actually run a competition for this franchise. But can he clarify how many compliant bids were received for the South Eastern franchise, and indeed how many compliant bids were received for the East Midlands franchise that was awarded 2 weeks ago?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes the point about is franchising dead? No, of course we managed to award a franchise only in the week just before Easter. So franchising as a process is working. Can we get the benefits out to passengers as fast as possible? Of course, that is what it's all about. But these are complex questions, and it's appropriate that we take our time to get it right. How many compliant bids? Well, it was obviously the issue of pensions that attracted a lot of attention for the East Midlands bid. We have 2 pension-compliant bids for the South Eastern franchise, and we look forward to making the announcement as soon as we possibly can.
Joseph Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend assure me that this further delay to the award of the franchise won't hold up the long-awaited works for Petswood and St Mary Cray Station to become fully accessible, something for which residents have been campaigning for many years?
Well, I obviously thank my right honourable friend for that question. You know, I share his enthusiasm for the Access for All process and the recent announcement of extra funds and where those funds will be targeted, made by my honourable friend. I can tell him that the design work on the stations selected will be starting over the summer and construction as soon as possible thereafter. I know that he will be anxious for the benefits to serve his constituents, and so am I, and so is the Minister, who I know is listening, and she's indicated that she'll be very happy to meet with my honourable friend to take that forward.
Rosie Duffield.
Mr. Speaker. Further to his letter of the 10th of April, where the Under-Secretary of State assured members that robust scrutiny would be used in this decision-making process, could he please reassure my beleaguered constituents in East Kent that he would also, that scrutiny will also apply to the exorbitant fare rises, constant delays and disruptions, and arbitrary timetable changes and removal of services?
Well, I can most certainly provide the Honourable Lady's constituents with the assurance that she is seeking. We will obviously be focusing upon fares. You know, we want to make sure that the travelling public gets a great deal, and that is why we have frozen regulated fares in line with inflation for the 6th year in a row. It is why also in January we saw the launch of the 16 to 18-year-old rail card, which will come into play later this year. So will there be attention on costs and on scrutiny, on fares? Of course there will. We will be maintaining that. And this policy, which has delivered its 6th year against Labour intentions, will be continuing.
Helen Grant.
Would the Minister please confirm that the City Thameslink service from Maidstone East will still be delivered before the end of the year? It's desperately needed and it's been promised on a multitude of occasions.
Well, my honourable friend has been a very diligent campaigner on this issue. I know it matters a lot to her and to her constituency. She has been a real vocal champion on this issue specifically. This is, however, also an industry-led process, but we are working with them to deliver the benefits as soon as possible. I can't comment immediately on this because it's not part of this franchise, but of course I will check the information. I will keep her posted on progress.
Tom Brake.
If the Rail Review recommends suburban services in the London area are transferred to London Government, will the Government allow South Eastern suburban services to be transferred in that way to maximise integration of transport services in London?
Well, that is a very interesting question. I would expect the Rail Review to make some interesting recommendations about devolution. I am personally a fan of devolution, but we'll better see what it says before commenting upon the outcome.
Sir David Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I note my honourable friend's statement today on South Eastern rail franchise. I'm, of course, bitterly disappointed that we have not made any progress on this matter, and in the meantime, my constituents continue to suffer a poor service into London. Also disappointingly, but rather ironically, just like the rail service, all we seem to see from his department are continued delay, and that is a great disappointment. As the Minister is well aware, improvements are desperately needed to our service in Bexley, the borough of Bexley, and not later this year or next year or sometimes never. Our constituents are paying more money for a poor service, and what we're expecting, really, is a decision so that we can look to the better future, so that the travelling public from Bexley has a better service. At the moment, it does not.
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very important point. He is a diligent campaigner on rail issues for his constituency. We saw that to important level, really, when there was the landslip earlier this year, and he was a great champion in making sure that the voices of his travelling constituents were heard in this House. We will be making the announcement on the decision on who wins the South Eastern franchise competition, but I can tell him that I am extremely keen to get the benefits that the franchise will bring to his constituents, and I'll be making sure that he's kept fully posted on progress.
Theresa Pearce.
There appears to be serious issue around rail pensions, and the Minister has said there are 2 pension-compliant bids on the table. Could the Minister say if the Department has made any changes to the franchise specifications in respect of pension obligations, and what conversations have been held with the pensions regulator regarding the deficit?
Well, the pensions regulator is obviously an independent body, and the pensions that we're talking about are those of private companies. So the role for government is not direct here, and at the moment operators are liable for the full pensions risk during their franchise term. These competitions actually, because that includes the East Midlands competition raised by her honourable friend from Nottingham earlier, included a risk-sharing mechanism with the government, which actually reduced the risk that operators are exposed to. In this, the operators retain risks that they are able to manage. So there has been some changes, but it's about risk sharing for the future. So there was a notable change in these franchises.
Helen Whately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is disappointing that, like so many South Eastern trains, the South Eastern franchise itself is delayed. My constituents expect the new franchise to give them improved services, to reduce overcrowding, delay repay 15 and smart ticketing and flexible season tickets, which is really important. Will my honourable friend make sure that though the franchise is delayed, these improvements won't be delayed, and can they actually be introduced in advance of the new franchise rather than us waiting so long?
Well, I obviously will have a look at what my honourable friend says, but the key benefits that have come into our rail services over the past few years have come in through the franchising process, as it has brought in private investment. That investment has purchased new rolling stock or leased new rolling stock, and that has been a transformation across the country for the travelling public. She is as impatient as I am that the benefits that we are seeing come to fruition for her constituents, and I will, of course, work to deliver those as fast as I possibly can.
Matthew Pennicook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The franchise specification promised extra capacity, it promised new rolling stock, greater frequency of trains and 15-minute delay replay. Improvements my constituents now won't see for at least another 7, perhaps 12 months. What specifically is the department going to do to improve services for passengers on South Eastern throughout the period of the franchise extension?
Well, I can tell the honourable gentleman that we're working to bring the franchise decision to a conclusion as fast as we possibly can and get the benefits right across the franchise which will come with that decision and get that in play as quickly as we can.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The delay to this franchise is not only a delay to the people of Tunbridge and Westmoreland and the towns and villages around, but it's actually also a delay to a strategy that the Minister, had already announced about the 15-minute compensation delay. Now, I do hope that his initial statement that this will wait until a change of franchise will no longer apply, and that instead he'll make the change from a 30-minute to a 15-minute compensation delay apply now. Because if we are to wait still further, then this is just simply going to cost commuters in the wonderful towns that I have the privilege to represent to have to pay more for delayed services.
Well, Delay Repay 15, which, Mr. Speaker, is a compensation system which would give any passenger who has been delayed by 15 minutes or more 25% of their fare back. That will be a part of all future franchise awards, but we have been able to make some in-franchise changes in other areas, in Northern and in Great Western very recently. So I will look at the point my honourable friend is making. I am aware of how well this has been received where we have been able to make those changes. It's not quite as straightforward as saying we need to make them, can do it immediately, but I know he is hungry for that benefit and I will do what I can to help him achieve that.
Clive Efford.
Mr. Speaker, I don't quite understand how the Minister can anonymise the two bids when there are only two bidders and one of them is the existing franchise. But that, setting that aside, I mean, this is a franchise that is fraying at the edges. And today, this afternoon, yet more delays because of a broken down train. Now, isn't it time that the Department of Transport spoke to the Mayor for London about London's suburban services and sorted out this mess once and for all?
Well, the process for the assessment and award of bids is handled away from ministers and handled by the output, the content of the bids, rather than by the bidder's name. So these things are handled in a way which is perhaps a little different to that the honourable gentleman suggests. In terms of conversations with the Mayor, well, I have had a conversation with the Mayor, but not on this issue. He came to the Department for Transport seeking a loan facility of over £2 billion to help with the completion of Crossrail, and we were able to help with that. It is, of course, a loan which will need to be repaid, but that loan has been made and he is, I believe, drawing down upon it. He is, of course, needs to answer some questions about the long-term viability of Transport for London's finances. And in terms of the performance on the network, well, of course there is more to be done. There is more to be done on every single franchise, and I want to make sure that we have services which are on time every time. 90% of trains on this franchise have been on time over the past few months, and when I looked at the performance earlier today, it was 97%. But of course, nobody wants to have any delays, and that is why it is my top priority.
Lucy Crouch.
Speaker, rail-using constituents of mine on the Maidstone East line, the Medway Valley line and from Chatham are fed up with being forced to pay through the nose to use a service beset by delays, lack of information and poor quality rolling stock. Continuous delays in deciding the next franchise provide no incentive for the current franchise holder to make any investment to improve services for today's users. So what can the Minister do to ensure that passengers receive the service that they pay for now rather than in the future, for which, like South Eastern, the timetable keeps changing?
Well, my honourable friend has been a champion for her travelling public, and I know that because she has made the point to me on a number of occasions, both in this House and in other meetings outside. What I can say is that the management of the franchise, as with all franchises, there is a performance regime which is operated through the Department for Transport. Whenever we see franchises failing in any way, we take action right away. I will say what I have said to other colleagues across the House is that I am impatient to see the benefits of this franchise award out there as soon as possible, and consequently I will be making sure we get this decision made as fast as we possibly can, and I'll keep her informed of progress.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is the fourth time the award of a new franchise has been delayed. Commuters from my constituency and from others across the South East have been facing delays, cancellations and overcrowding on trains. The continued delay is preventing long-term investment and improvements which are placing millions of passengers at a disadvantage. Will the Minister therefore provide an update on the timeline for the award, be transparent about the reasons for the repeated delay and outline a long-term view on the viability of the franchise system as a whole?
Minister.
Well, my view on the franchise system as a whole is that it has been a part of our improvement in our rail performance as measured by the number of services, measured by the number of passengers and measured by the quality of journeys over the past few years. So the benefits of a privately run industry have been profound. I cannot answer the Honourable Lady's questions because this is market-sensitive information. There is information which will need to be announced to the markets and to the House in the normal manner when the decisions are made.
Bob Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I happen to agree with my honourable friend the Minister about the benefits that come from franchising. Now, having made that point, perhaps he will take it in the spirit in which I make it when I say that if you were paying someone to discredit the franchising process, the way his department has gone about it couldn't be bettered. It is an utter shambles. In order not to add insult to injury to my long-suffering constituents, will he return to the very fair point made by my honourable friend, the member for Tunbridge and Malling, that the very least the department can do is, if they seek an extension to the current franchise and they continue to get the financial benefit, they shall be obliged to bring in 15-minute delay repay straight away, not waiting.
Well, the issue for me is, of course, how we make sure that the trains are run on time every time, but when things go wrong, we need to see a compensation scheme which is fair to the travelling public. I share the impatience that my honourable friend has in terms of getting the benefits that will come through this franchise award to the constituency served so well. I will keep him updated on progress, including the point made to my honourable friend from Tunbridge about DR15.
Phil Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister knows, the contract for the rolling stock for the Deep Tube contract for London Underground was awarded to a company which intends to build the majority of the rolling stock in Austria, having promised that it will be built in the UK. What guarantees can the Minister give that the company which is awarded the new South East rolling stock contract will build the trains in the UK, and providing work for train companies such as Hitachi and Newton Aycliffe in my constituency?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is a great champion for that rail company in his constituency. He has told me about it on a number of occasions, and I hope to be visiting the plant very shortly. I have met with them, and I am aware of the quality of the product which they have. I cannot direct a private company where they should be placing an order. We are in an open market economy. We have competition. That competition delivers passenger benefits. Competition helps deliver value, helps deliver passenger experiences which were never possible when this was a nationalised railway. But I'm sure those who are making the purchasing decisions will be aware of the points that the Honourable Gentleman is making and of the merits of British manufacturing.
Gareth Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These delays are very regrettable, but they do at least give the Minister an opportunity of having a look again at the terms of the franchise. I was very pleased when the Oyster card system was extended out to Dartford to cater for my constituents. Does the Minister agree, therefore, that any new franchise that's awarded should have a term in it that ensures that smart ticketing is extended beyond the current boundaries that we experience?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very wise point as ever. I think that smart ticketing is a part of the rail future right across the country, not just in the constituency of Dartford. The pay-as-you-go extension has been very popular across the South East, but the benefits of smart ticketing are the convenience for passengers, the ability to change tickets more easily. The benefits are profound, and we're trying to make sure they are part of all franchises going forward.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister's referred to the Williams Review several times this afternoon. We know that Keith Williams has already warned about the government micromanaging the rail industry, driving passengers away, and he's also said that the current franchise system is damaging to innovation. So does the Minister agree with those comments?
Minister.
Well, I think there are points within the current operation of the franchise system which can be improved, and I would suggest that micromanaging from government is not helpful. I will, of course, point out that the Labour position is to micromanage everything from government by nationalising the railways. So there is a little bit of inconsistency. There is a little bit of inconsistency in what the honourable lady is saying.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Bexhill and Battle will be disappointed with this delay, but I have every faith in the Minister in terms of getting this right. Can I just ask the Minister this, though? The Transport Select Committee have looked at the franchising process over a number of reports. It's very complex, very detailed, and as a result can be very expensive and litigious. Will there be an opportunity to simplify the franchising process so we don't experience these kinds of delays when making decisions?
I think the simplification of the structure of the industry, including the franchising process, will be, I hope, one of the outputs we see from the Williams Review.
Thank you. Order. Very briefly. Point of order, Tonia Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask for your guidance because I went outside into Parliament Square to speak to members of Extinction Rebellion who wanted to exercise their right to come into Parliament to lobby their MP. I'm holding over 100 letters to MPs. What guidance could I give when I was out there, but what guidance would the Speaker give to those people who are unable today to exercise their rights?
Well, I have been attending to my duties in the chair, so I cannot comment on what restrictions on access to or egress from the estate have applied, either as a matter of policy or on account of the very large numbers of people who may be around. But I think that insofar as the honourable lady is seeking to give voice to the concerns of her constituents and of others who are campaigning on this subject, she has found her own salvation, because she's made the point, she's held up the letters, it will be on the record in the official report, and I think, therefore, honour is served. Thank you. Order. Colleagues, in respectful memory of the 321 people slaughtered in the appalling Easter Sunday terrorist attack in Sri Lanka, including 8 British citizens, and of the approximately 500 people wounded in those attacks, I propose that we now hold a 1-minute silence. East. Thank you.
Order. Statement the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Secretary Jeremy Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, today the flags in Downing Street and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office are flying at half-mast following the horrific Easter Day terrorist attack in Sri Lanka. With your permission, I'd like to update the House on the attack and the UK government's response. On Sunday, multiple terrorist suicide bombings were conducted across Sri Lanka. 6 explosions occurred simultaneously, 3 in churches conducting Easter Day services in Colombo, Negombo and Batticaloa, and 3 more in hotels in Colombo, popular with foreign visitors. Information is still coming in, but we know that over 300 people have been killed. And we know that at least 8 of those, sadly, are British nationals. They include Mother Anita Nicholson with her 14-year-old son Alex and 11-year-old daughter Annabelle, teenage brother and sister Amelie and Daniel Lindsay, retired firefighter Bill Harrop with his wife, retired GP Sally Bradley. The whole House will want to pass on our deepest sympathies and condolences as we digest a truly heartbreaking situation. I spoke to James Doris, the British High Commissioner in Colombo, earlier this afternoon, and want to put on record my thanks to him, his team and all the employees of the British Council for their dedication in extremely testing circumstances. One locally employed British Council employee is in hospital with his wife, both with serious injuries, and our thoughts are also with them and their family. Our travel advice has been updated and remains the best source of information for any British nationals or family members who have concerns about the situation. Yesterday I spoke to my counterpart, the Sri Lankan Foreign Minister, to express my thanks for the work of the emergency services in Sri Lanka, as well as pass on our condolences to all the bereaved families. I also discussed what further support the UK might be able to offer. Her Majesty the Queen, the Prince of Wales and other members of the royal family have sent messages of condolence to the President and people of Sri Lanka, and the Prime Minister is expected to speak with the Sri Lankan Prime Minister Wickrem Singh later today. Mr. Speaker, these attacks were a primitive and vile attempt to sow division between people of different faiths. Religious tensions have caused some of the bloodiest battles in human history, and it is sombre and sobering that even in the 21st century, attempts continue to set believers of different religions against each other. Our response must be to deny the perpetrators the satisfaction of dividing us by being united in our condemnation and united in our support for religious tolerance, surely one of humanity's greatest achievements. Just as after the equally horrific attacks on the 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, we must respond by bringing people together, the exact opposite of what was intended by the perpetrators. It has to be said, the sheer brutality of these attacks was stark. One pair of attackers, after detonating their first explosives in a hotel, waited for people to try to escape before detonating a second device. The device destroyed by security services at Colombo Airport was most likely designed to target fleeing civilians. The attack was complex, tightly coordinated, and designed to cause maximum chaos, damage, and heartbreak. The UK will never stand by in the face of such evil. So today we stand in solidarity with the government and people of Sri Lanka, who have been making enormous strides towards stability and peace following the conclusion of the civil war almost exactly 10 years ago. The Metropolitan Police's Counter-Terrorism Command has dispatched a team of specialists to Sri Lanka, including family liaison officers, to support and assist the families of British victims and the repatriation of deceased British nationals. A recent programme run by Interpol involved the training of 30 Sri Lankan forensic specialists and police officers by UK experts in disaster victim identification, which we also hope will be of additional support. The government of Sri Lanka has declared a state of emergency as the investigation continues. More than 20 arrests have been made, and there are likely to be more people involved in the planning of this attack who are still at large. Large amounts of IED materials have been recovered, including 87 low-explosive detonators recovered from a bus station. There are no verified claims of responsibility as yet. So far, 40 arrests have been made, and counter-terrorism activity continues. The Sri Lankan Prime Minister and President have both said publicly that there will be a thorough investigation into the incident and whether information was handled correctly, and it's important to let that process follow its course. Mr. Speaker, to attack Christian worshippers on Easter, a celebration of peace and the holiest day in the Christian calendar, betrays in these attackers an absence of the most basic values of humanity. Just 2 days ago, the Prime Minister and I both noted in our Easter messages of the dangers facing Christians around the world, 300 of whom are killed every month. In response to such acts, we must redouble our efforts to protect the freedom of religious minorities to practice their faiths wherever they are in the world. And for that reason, the FCO has asked the Bishop of Truro to do an independent report into what more can be done to protect persecuted Christians around the world. The British government will continue to give its wholehearted support to the people of Sri Lanka, and I'm sure the House will join me once again in expressing our deepest sadness and sympathy to everyone affected by these monstrous attacks. And I commend this statement to the House.
Emily Thornbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement and for the tone of his words, with which I wholeheartedly agree. Let me join him in commending the work of the British High Commission in Colombo, who have once again demonstrated that in the very worst of circumstances of British nationals abroad, our consular services offer the very best of support. And I am sure that they will continue to ensure that the families of those British nationals who have so tragically been killed in these attacks will continue to get all the support they need at this time of unbearable shock and sadness. I have also full confidence in what the Foreign Secretary says when it comes to the assistance that this government is ready to offer to the Sri Lankan authorities, whether it's in relation to security and intelligence or with help for the forensic services. And he has our support and our thanks for that. I know that there are many questions to be asked about who was responsible for these attacks and what could have been done to prevent them. But today, frankly, is not a time for those questions. On this day of national mourning in Sri Lanka, as the first of those killed are buried and the death toll continues to mount, today is simply a time for this House and for this country to stand with the people of Sri Lanka and with those British families and those from around the world who have lost loved ones, and express our shared solidarity and grief at the devastation that they have suffered, and also to stand in admiration at the way the Sri Lankan people and their government have responded to this attempt to divide them by instead coming together in peace and calling for unity of all communities. And we in the West must do our part too to help Sri Lanka recover from this horror by continuing to visit that beautiful country and showing the terrorists that they will not win. But, Mr. Speaker, it is sadly apt that on St. George's Day, when we mark both the birth and the death of Shakespeare, we are confronted with this latest example of what he once called mountainish inhumanity. The unspeakable inhumanity and evil of men who would walk into a group of peaceful Christian worshippers at prayer, or happy foreign tourists having breakfast, and blow these innocent people up, killing at least 320, including 45 children, including an 8-year-old cousin of our good friend, the member for Hampstead and Kilburn. Dozens are still fighting for their lives in hospital, and hundreds more have received life-changing injuries. And when we ask how anyone's mind could become so warped and depraved and as to commit such an act, just as we did about the attack on Muslims in Christchurch last month, on Jews in Pittsburgh last October, we must not make the mistake of blaming religion, because there is no religion on this earth which teaches that the way to salvation is blowing up innocent children or shooting people at prayer, we must also not make the mistake of saying that one act of evil begets another, that somehow this atrocity happened because of the atrocity in Christchurch. I believe that that is an entirely false narrative and one that excuses terrorism, and we should never indulge it. Instead, we should call it out for what it is, an act born of pure, vicious, mind-polluting hatred, perpetuated by sickening, despicable individuals who don't worship God, they worship death, whose only religion is hate, and whose fellow believers in hatred and in death must be wiped from the face of our earth. But in these dark and terrible moments, I do see one shred of light and one piece of definite proof that the narrative which says that evil begets evil, that we reap what we sow, is indeed a false one. And that was the deeply moving statement made by Ben Nicholson, confirming the loss of his wife and his 2 daughters in the blast at Shangri-La Hotel. I do not think that there is any one of us who could understand what that grief would feel like. And we would all have understood if Mr. Nicholson's reaction had been one of anger and hatred towards the people who had destroyed his family. But instead, his response was filled with love. For his wife and his beautiful daughters, he rejected hatred, the hatred that had killed his family, and he responded to them with a mountainous humanity. A humanity which no act of evil could corrupt, because, as Shakespeare also wrote, Mr. Speaker, unkindness may defeat my life, but never taint my love.
Can I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary for not just the tone of her comments, but also the very moving way that she delivered them. And I want to thank her for her support for the work of the British High Commission, which is particularly challenging at this time. And we are indeed giving help to the Sri Lankan government. The 2 areas that they particularly requested help are in counter-terrorism work and countering violent extremism, of which we sadly have a lot of experience in this country as well. I think she's right to say that at times like this, bringing people together with a message of unity and reconciliation is the only approach. And I think people on all sides of this House were immensely inspired by the tone taken by the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern after the horrific attacks in Christchurch. And I know the Sri Lankan government is making every attempt to take the same approach. And I thank her for talking about the extraordinarily generous response that Ben Nicholson made after losing his wife and 2 children. And I also agree with her that these kind of attacks, far from being religious, are condemned by people of all faiths and none for their utter depravity. And the final point I wanted to make, was simply that whilst it is right that in this House we think about the 8 British people who lost their lives, the vast majority of people who were murdered were themselves Sri Lankans at church on Easter morning, celebrating the resurrection of Christ and life. They did not deserve to suffer this way, and it is absolutely right that we remember them as well.
Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend my right honourable friend's statement, also for his raising the reality, which is clear to us all, that these attacks were planned to have the maximum effect on the single biggest day in a Christian calendar, when children are encouraged to be in the church celebrating what has been the resurrection for Christians of Christ. And therefore they would have known that the maximum effect would have been devastating. But does he agree with me also, and following the spokesman from the opposition, that the reality is that the one thing that Easter teaches us, it's about sacrifice for others, and that therefore forgiveness that follows. And I wonder if he will therefore ensure that no matter what else happens, we give our greatest support to the Sri Lankan government in pursuing those who have conducted this terrible attack, but at the same time recognising that the Christian faith is about forgiveness.
Yeah. Well, I thank him for saying those brave words. It's very difficult, I think, for many people to think about forgiveness after what happened, but that is indeed an appropriate thing for Christians to think about, particularly at the time of Easter. But forgiveness doesn't mean the absence of justice, and that's why it is absolutely essential that we support the Sri Lankan authorities in their determination to track down everyone responsible. We know that they have identified other people who have not yet been arrested who they're looking for at the moment, and obviously for the safety and security of everyone in Sri Lanka, it's vital that they are found. But I thank him for the generosity of his comments.
Stephen Gethings.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement and join him in thanking the High Commissioner, everybody at the High Commission in Colombo, and also the rest of the Foreign Office officials who must have worked in the most difficult and distressing circumstances over the weekend, and extend our thanks to the Sri Lankan emergency services as well for their efforts and work. At this time, our thoughts are obviously with all those who are affected, and condolences for the families who have had loved ones taken away in the cruelest of circumstances. That loss of life is always sad, but I have to say that I found it particularly heartbreaking in how many children were killed in this attack. And the brave and touching statement from Mr Nicholson is something that is a lesson for each and every one of us. Mr Speaker, savage acts of terrorism don't discriminate by age, but they also don't discriminate by faith either. And these attempts to sow division through violence at Easter of all times should be met with a response of peace and solidarity. Our message is that barbarism strengthens our belief in our common humanity, regardless of faith, background or ethnicity. And Mr Speaker, can I thank the Foreign Secretary for the work that is ongoing with the Sri Lankan authorities. I'm glad to see that that assistance will be ongoing. But at the moment, our prayers and our thoughts are with all those affected, and the message has to be from this place that hate and violence will not win out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I thank him for his comments with which I wholeheartedly agree, and I think obviously the number of child victims of many, many nationalities is one of the most heartbreaking things to have occurred. I think also what this event reminds us is that when we talk about Christians suffering around the world, we're not talking about wealthy Westerners. We're talking about some of the poorest people in the world. It's only 8% of the population in Sri Lanka. And sometimes that fact has been obscured in terms of the priorities that we set ourselves as a country, and that's what we're hoping to put right with this review that's being done by the Bishop of Truro.
Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank both the Foreign Secretary and the Right Honourable Lady for their tone and the statements they've made today, and through the Foreign Secretary and from experience express my thanks to Foreign Office and other UK government personnel who will be involved in dealing with the aftermath of the incident. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary particularly for expressing so clearly the indiscriminate nature of terrorist violence, and ask if he agrees with me that the best way to protect the Christian community or any community in the future is to ensure that the rule of law is